Hi there. So we're back for our next class in our Genome 15,000 workbook. This month we're going to be talking about bobbin work. And if you've never heard about bobbin work before, basically what it is this is an opportunity for us to do a decorative stitching technique in which we're going to be use a variety of different kinds of decorative threads that basically are too thick to fit through the eye of a needle. And what we're going to do with them is, instead of trying to get them through the eye of a needle to sew with them, we're going to be winding them onto bobbins, and we're going to be using that beautiful thread on the in the bobbin. And what we're going to find out is that when we stitch this onto our fabric, we're always going to be stitching on the back side of the fabric, so that the bobbin work, which is going to appear on the front side, is going to create some beautiful texture. And there's lots of different techniques that we can do with bobbin work. So I first of all just want to introduce you to the chapter in our book. It begins on page 78, and there's only 2 pages about bobbin work in our workbook this month. It's 78 and 79. And what our introduction tells us in the workbook is that it is a technique which allows the use of threads that cannot be threaded in the needle to add texture detail to any project. Pearl cotton, polyester or rayon floss, heavy metallic threads, thin yarns, narrow silk ribbons are all choices of things that you might want to try to wind onto bobbins in order to do bobbin work with them. The book also will tell us that you can do this kind of bobbin work on any kind of fabric, as long as what you have done with your fabric is that you have prepared it properly, and you are going to need some kind of stabilization to that fabric so that it does hold up well during this process of doing the bobbin work. So typically that means that if it's going to be a type of fabric that could later on be washed, you might want to go ahead and do some nice pre-shrinking of that fabric. You would want to starch it or put some other kind of liquid stabilizer on there in order to start stiffening up that fabric. Oftentimes, in addition to that kind of treatment of the fabric, you will want to use either a tear-away stabilizer, maybe a wash-away stabilizer, or something along those lines that could later on be removed. And again, that would depend on the project that you're actually making. So, you have to kind of think about your project from the beginning and decide what your end result is that you're going to want to be, so that you can start planning ahead for what kind of stabilizers and preparation of the fabrics that you might need for your project. All right, so basically what I'm going to talk to you about first is just that introduction in the book, which basically is going to give us some basic information about doing bobbin work, and it will give us also just a couple of different ideas of doing some decorative stitch techniques on our fabric with bobbin work, but it doesn't really go a whole lot into some of the other finer details about doing this on our machines. So first of all, let's talk about needles. Well, your needle is just going to actually be something that's going to be appropriate for the fabric that you're stitching on, because what is happening here is what you're going to be having in your needle is going to be a thread that one of 2 things, maybe 3 things, is going to be either matched to the color of your fiber that you have in your bobbin. So let's just say, for example, that I'm just pulling up a spool of thread. I'm using a red heavyweight thread. I might want to use in my needle a thread that matches this color, or the predominant color of this variegated thread, if it were what I was going to be using. If I was using a solid color, let's just say I'm using a purple thread, I might try to find a needle thread that matches more or less this beautiful purple color. Or another option could also be to use a monofilament thread. That's very popular for doing decorative stitching techniques like bobbin work, because you don't have to worry about that thread, and with all the tension issues that might be going on with bobbin work, you wouldn't want that thread to show up. What you really are working toward when you're thinking about your needle thread is something that's not going to be obvious along with the bobbin work. I'm going to be showing you some samples of bobbin work in a little few minutes, and that will begin to make a little bit more sense to all of us. So basically that's what you're looking for. You want your needle to be appropriate to the fabric that you're stitching with, and you want your thread to be appropriate to the colors of the project that you're working on, or using monofilament thread. What about different kinds of thread? I've got a special thread box, and this is it right here, and there's lots of different threads in here for different things that I have purchased over the years, projects that I've worked on. Some threads are actually marketed to be used specifically for bobbin work. This is one of them. This is one that I'm going to be showing you some samples in a little while that I use. This is a thread that is made by Superior Thread Company, and it's called Razzle Dazzle. Beautiful textured thread, quite heavy, a lot of glitz, and it's got a lot of metallic highlights in it. Very pretty thread. And this thread actually will tell you on the spool that this is made for bobbin work, for decorative stitching, and to be used in the loopers of a serger. So you know right off the bat, if you read the label on something like this, that it's never going to be even attempt to try to put this through the eye of the needle. It really is used on the underside of your work or on a serger. Another thread that is marketed to be used in that same kind of situation is this Pearl Crown Rayon. This is made by YLI Corporation. They do lots of beautiful decorative stitching threads. This is a rayon thread. Again, it's about, I don't know, I don't think it really says what the weight is on it, but I'm going to say that it's probably about a 12 weight, maybe a 10, something like that. It's very thick. It's about 2 plies of thread that are twisted together, and it's got a beautiful sheen to it. That works beautifully for bobbin work. Another one that works really well in bobbin work is some of the threads that come from the Sulky Corporation. Now, Sulky makes, see if I can find one that's easy to get to. Sulky makes lots of beautiful textured threads. Unfortunately, one of the things about some of the Sulky threads is that they come on really tiny little spools like this, and sometimes they're designed to be used in the eye of a needle, but because of that tiny twist on that spool, you might have some difficulty trying to get that to sew out beautifully. You know, so sometimes you can find threads with all kinds of different fibers that are really, really beautiful. So what about this thread here? This is one that maybe you've never thought about using before. Crochet threads. You know, they come in lots of different weights, not lots and lots, but you know, quite a few different weights. This one here is a pearl cotton that's on a little spool, and this works really beautiful for bobbin work. Pearl cotton comes in lots of different weights. I think it's maybe a 3, a 5, maybe an 8 or 10, something along the lines of that. And like I said, they're typically used for crocheting and tatting and that kind of crafty kinds of things, but they also will work really well on a machine. So in a little while, we're going to be talking about how to wind bobbins, and I'll talk a little bit more about this one at that time. Pearl cotton also comes on skeins like this that you can buy in the needlework section of your craft store or fabric stores. And another fiber that can be used, although this is one that's not necessarily highly recommended, is embroidery floss. I've got tons of this because I used to do lots of hand embroidery and cross stitch and that kind of thing. So when I've done some research about bobbin work, this is one of the ones that they say they don't highly recommend. And I think that the reason why is because if you're familiar with an embroidery thread like this embroidery floss, you'll know that it actually is composed of 6 different plies or fibers that have been twisted together, and they're designed to be separated from one another so that as you do your embroidery, then you can adjust the thickness of those embroidery designs depending on how many plies you have. So this ability of this thread to separate like this is why it's not always highly recommended to use as bobbin work, because when you're doing bobbin work, you want the upper thread of your machine to catch that bobbin thread and to hold it all together as it's forming the stitches. And with embroidery floss, you might have times when those plies would begin to separate from themselves as it's coming up out of the bobbin area. However, I do need to say that years ago, before I knew this suggestion about not using embroidery floss, I actually made several decoratively stitched cushions for my daughter, and what we used was embroidery floss. And it worked beautifully. I didn't have any problems with the plies separating or anything like that. And so, you know, the message to you all really is just try it. You don't have to wind a whole lot of bobbins right in the beginning. What you're going to want to do is wind one bobbin of a particular fiber and, you know, do some testing with it and see how you like the effects. So you'll have to probably do lots of different samples as you're learning how to do bobbin work with the different fibers. So what about winding a bobbin? Well, obviously, if it's something that's coming off of a spool of thread, oh, this is something that I do want to mention to you first of all. You know, there have been times when one of the threads that we might have purchased, and we might have it in great quantities, just kind of depending on, you know, different things that you've been attracted to, is metallic thread. Now, metallic thread is notorious for being a little bit problematic in embroidery and in decorative stitching on our sewing machines. And even though you may have bought a very high quality of a metallic thread, you may have difficulty stitching with this in your machine. So don't throw them away, because you can use them for other kinds of decorative stitching techniques. And I think that even though it's not necessarily a thick thread, this is just a regular 40 weight metallic thread. Putting this into the bobbin of the machine just might be a way that you can use some of these metallic threads, and you're not going to get the huge textury effect with them because it's not a thick thread, but you could probably get some really good stitching techniques done with some of these problematic threads. I'm not saying that this one was a problem, but you know, I know that you all have some embroidery threads out there that you have purchased, you know, with high hopes that just didn't work out. So consider using metallic threads. All right, so what about winding bobbins? Typically, when it's just a regular kind of a heavyweight thread, such as this pearl crown rayon that I pulled out a little while ago, wind it just like you would wind any other regular bobbin. Run it through the tension discs, fill up a bobbin with it. Because they're thick threads, you're not going to get lots and lots of yards on there. So, you know, if you decide that this is a thread that you want to use in your project, after testing it out and figuring out what stitches and techniques you want to use, you might want to wind several bobbins of it, you know, so that you can just zip on through with your project. All right, so wind them just normally. There are some threads that you will want to probably wind by hand, and you're going to have an option with that, and those are the ones that are coming on a spool like this. I don't think that, even though it's on a spool, I don't think this would wind in a bobbin using the typical bobbin winding technique very well. So what I would suggest doing, and the reason why is because you can see that this is wrapped all the way around the inner tube, cardboard tube that this is wound onto, and I don't think that this would come off of there onto, you know, a winding of a bobbin very well. I think that we would probably need to do some preparation work. So for that, save yourself some empty bobbins from your threads. Probably all of us have done that at least one time or another. And, you know, so have a couple of bobbins like this. You'd want to pre-wind this off onto here, you know, just kind of depending on how many yards or whatever you think you might need, and then putting this on the machine to wind your bobbin with it. Same thing would go if your thread obviously was on a skein such as this. This is a pearl cotton that I did buy on a skein for a project, and I did wind it onto a bobbin by hand, and then you can put this onto your machine to wind it onto your bobbin. If you're not comfortable winding it on a bobbin, using your bobbin tension and all of that, I would suggest going ahead and just winding it by hand onto the bobbin. Just make sure that as you're winding it on, that you try to keep a nice even consistency on the empty bobbin. So, you know, here would be your empty bobbin, and here would be your thread. What I would suggest doing with this, so that you get a good start on it, is coming from the inside through the outside. You know, you've got that little tiny hole on each one of your Janome bobbins, and you could just pull the thread through. I'm not going to do it right now, but pull it through the hole, hold on to that, and then evenly wind this back and forth here on your empty bobbin. All right, so that's one of the couple of the different ways that you can treat, you know, how to deal with your bobbins. The next thing we're going to talk about is your bobbin case. Now, Janome is recommending in our workbook that we use the blue dot bobbin case. So hopefully by now all of you have already purchased one of these. They didn't come with our Janome 15,000 machine. You're going to know that it's the blue dot because it's got the little blue mark on it right here at the front. What is a blue dot bobbin case? It's a case that has a looser tension on it. So as you probably are remembering, and just to run through it again quickly, our red case is the one that is with the balanced tension. That's the one that we usually use whenever we're doing any sewing or decorative stitching. Sometimes we use it when we're doing embroidery. The other case that came with our machines is the one that has a yellow dot on it. And the yellow dot is one that's got a really high tension. It's about 2 times tighter than the red case. And this one here, I've never heard a number about how much looser the blue is from the red, but I would suggest that maybe it's about 4 times looser. I don't know. Typically, this is the case that you're going to be using whenever you're doing free motion quilting and that kind of thing. The reason why they want us to use it for bobbin work is because of the tension being looser. That's going to allow space for that extra thick thread to run through the bobbin tension springs. So do you know about the bobbin tension springs? I'm going to try to hold this up close to the camera. This right in here is your tension spring between this little piece of metal right in here and the metal piece that's right there. So as you know, whenever you're winding your bobbin, when you have this in your machine, you're dropping your bobbin in and you're running it through that tension so that you've got a nice tension on your sewing project. This space is the tension. So, you know, there's a book that I wanted to talk about this earlier and I just neglected to mention it. Cindy Loskamp, who is a educator who travels around the United States doing all kinds of different classes, came and did a series of classes for us at the Sewing Center many years ago. And one of the projects that we all worked on from this book of Cindy Loskamp's Let's Get Creative was a project where we just did a lot of different samples of doing bobbin work. And what Cindy Loskamp does recommend, and this is in the days before most of the sewing machine companies were coming out with lots of different bobbin cases for various techniques, is that she was already recommending back here that you would purchase an additional bobbin case to use for your bobbin work. And the reason why is because of the very thing that I'm talking about. That's the bobbin case that you could play with the tension on it. You could loosen it or tighten it and, you know, just do some different things without messing up the main bobbin case that you use for most of your other sewing. So she did recommend having a separate bobbin case. I think that's a great suggestion. Or use your blue dot bobbin case. So do you see, you can play with your tension on your bobbin cases, and there are two little screws on every one of our Janome bobbin cases. There's one right here, and then there's another one right here. This one that I'm pointing to right now is the one right here. It's a flathead screw that you would adjust on it. Can you see that there? I'm hoping it shows up well on the camera. Righty tighty, lefty loosey. So you can adjust your bobbin case if you want to using a little tiny screwdriver. Just remember where your starting point is at, okay? So that, you know, just kind of keep track if you're playing with tension on here, you know, whether or not you've turned it a quarter turn to the left or a half a turn to the left or whatever it might be, so that you can get it back there again once you have finished with your testing out your bobbin case. So this is one way that you can use a bobbin case with a looser tension on your machine. The other thing is that you don't even always have to run your decorative stitches through the tension of your bobbin case. One of the ways that when you do run it through the tension on the case, you're going to get a little bit more of a controlled look to your bobbin work. In other words, it's not going to be quite as wild and lumpy and crazy, but you can completely bypass it just by dropping your bobbin in, pulling up the bobbin thread to the upper side of your work and doing your decorative stitching that way, and you're going to get a much more textured look. I'm going to show you some samples in just a little bit here. What about your presser foot? You're going to be wanting for your Janome machine to use your decorative stitching presser foot. Really, really important, because bobbin work is going to be building up all that bulk underneath the back side of your work, and the area that's carved out on our decorative stitching foot is going to give that nice ability for the machine and the presser foot to just glide on over all the thread that's building up there. So you can use either your F2 foot, which is the open toe version, or your regular F foot. But that is definitely what you're going to want to use when you're doing any kind of decorative stitches on the bobbin work or any of the regular straight stitches. Obviously, if you were doing free motion work, you would be using one of your presser feet that works for free motion work on your machine. All right, so I have talked about threads, I've talked about needles, I've talked about tension on the bobbin case. Let me show you some samples that we made in our workshop with Cindy Loskamp years ago. So I do have to say, you know, I didn't pull it out, but I do have a jacket that I did some machine embroidery bobbin work on, and I didn't pull that out to show you as a sample, so I'm just going to show you these little samples here. This is a sample of just doing some regular zigzag satin stitches using bobbin work. So again, you know, I'm going to be stitching from the back side of the fabric. The bobbin was wound with that pretty razzle-dazzle thread that I was showing you just a little while ago. All of these samples, in fact, were stitched with this particular thread. So you can see here from going from left to the right, I played with the stitch settings on the machine. Basically, I kept the width of the stitch about the same on all of these, but I did adjust the stitch length so that I got here, you know, I've got a little bit thicker of a line. These ones are a little bit more sparse. Just to show you that you really do need to experiment with your stitches. That's just a regular satin zigzag, which comes out really quite nice. Here I've got where I did some free motion stitches with a straight stitch on the machine. So it's just my regular straight stitch, and I had drawn on the back side here a little zigzaggy, wobbly lined square, and just followed these lines doing free motion work. Same thing basically could happen with just using the straight stitch on your machine, either running the bobbin thread through the tension, loose tension of the machine would give it probably a pretty similar look to what we've got going on right here. Or you could bypass the tension completely and you might get a little bit more of a lumpy look. So, you know, just straight stitches can do some really cool things. Here I've got a sample of decorative stitches that were done using bobbin work. All of these were done on a machine that only had a 7mm wide stitch on it. And look how pretty those are. So what you're looking for when we're doing decorative stitches on our machine is that you want something that's going to be a mostly forward moving stitch. You don't want it to be too complicated nor too dense of a stitch, because then you are going to have some problems with the machine trying to feed all that fabric and all that bulky thread through there. So I'm going to hold this up at an angle so that you can kind of see the beautiful texture that was created using bobbin thread. This was the direction of the stitching, was starting from that direction on down. So I've got satin stitches, I've got a couple of other, you know, feathers and just different things that worked really well for bobbin work here. Okay, isn't that pretty? Next, we have a sample of doing some satin stitching. Again, you know, this is on a sample of something that we drew a little paisley design on the back side of our fabric. And this is the side that we were doing our stitching from. Decorative stitch was in the decorative thread, excuse me, was in the bobbin. And here, I have some notes on my little sample that the inner part of this paisley, I tried to do that as a free motion work. And then the outer side here, I did as a regular with regular presser foot down, and followed the line just to work with that satin zigzag stitch. Next, I did a sample of some free motion thread painting. Now, this is not a technique that I would ever claim that I'm good at or have even done very much of. And what we did here is we drew some sort of a shape here. It looks like it was kind of a Jacobean style of a leaf or something along those lines. And we did our little scribbling back and forth with our thread. This took a lot of thread, and I see that probably the reason I never finished it was because I ran out of thread before I got to fill in all the areas of the design. But at any rate, this is thread painting with bobbin work, free motion. Thick and textury, very pretty, and I wish, you know, if you could feel this, it really is quite intriguing looking at that one. This is one that I particularly like a lot, and I'm actually using this technique in the class sample for the project that we're going to be working on. This was just a little pre-printed piece of fabric that the teacher gave to us, and we fused it down. We didn't fuse it. I think we may have just either basted it or 505'd it down or something along those lines. And then we did all the little frame around that using that grass stitch, which is in the decorative stitching category. The grass stitch is the one that just looks sort of like what we sometimes call the EKG, little ziggy-zaggy stitch. And again, you know, it's not quite as wide. It's probably only about a 5mm wide, which was appropriate for the dimension of this little picture. And we stitched it from the back side, of course. So we had to mark our fabric where that square was going to be, or that rectangle shape was going to be, and then, you know, did our beautiful little frame around our fussy cut piece of fabric. Last of all, this is a sample of some free motion work. This is the back side. This is the front side. Are you one of those people that is always saving all those bits and pieces of threads that, you know, when you're rethreading our embroidery machine, sometimes we're in the habit of pulling our thread, clipping it off at the bobbin above the needle and pulling it all through. And maybe you've been saving a bag full of decorative embroidery threads over the years. Or maybe you've got other fibers such as yarns and other kinds of decorative things that you're stashing away to do some sort of texture-y, artsy kind of a project. So this was done with that in mind. I remember that the way that we did this is that we piled a bunch of threads and fibers on the front side of our fabric. We put a piece of water-soluble stabilizer on top of that, probably 505 sprayed it down or something just to hold everything in place here on our fabric sandwich. And then from the back side, we just did some free motion scribbling with our needle and thread to hold it all together, and then we rinsed it out and had this interesting little piece of textured art. I'm sure you could think of lots of different ways that you could use something like this in a project someday. So those are just some of the samples of things that I've done that we did in that class, basically out of the book here about the creative stitching techniques that Cindy Loskamp came up with. So there's lots of different things that are inside of this book that are really an interesting way to further our uses of our embroidery and sewing machines. So one of the other things that I do want to mention before I close out this little video is that when we are doing, there's a couple of different things that you always have to do whenever you are working with bobbin work on your machine. One of those things is that you always need to pull up your bobbin thread to the top side of your work. And the reason why is, especially with our decorative stitches on our Janome machines, all of our decorative stitches are always going to begin with a tie-in, which, as you know, is basically about 3 little stitches all in place. And we don't have the ability to turn that function off in our decorative stitching. So that already, right from the very beginning on a decorative stitched sample, is going to create a little bit of bulk on the back side of our fabric. Let's see if I can get that sample back up here. And what you're going to see here, hopefully this would show up here. This is the beginning of my line of stitching. All right, so you pull up your bobbin thread to the front side of your work, and then you begin with your stitching line. And later on, what you would do with this is you're going to thread this onto a hand sewing needle and take it to the back side of the work to clip it off on the back side. So always pull up the bobbin thread at the beginning of the work, no matter what it is that you're doing with your bobbin work, whether or not it's decorative stitches, whether it's free motion work, or whatever. The next thing is that you're never, ever going to use the automatic tie-off that's on our machine. That's the lock stitch button, right? And the reason why is because, again, that would create that knot at the end of the line of stitching, which would create a big old lumpy mess on the backside, which you would not want, unless, of course, you were going to be cutting that off and, you know, covering it up somewhere. So you're not going to use a lock stitch button. You are going to pull up your bobbin thread. Another thing is that you will need to turn your thread cutter off on the machine. So most of our machines are set so that when we use our lock stitch button or our reverse button, the scissors are going to be activated, and that's going to cut all the threads on the machine. These heavy threads, your thread cutter on your machine are not going to like them. So make sure that you go into the settings before you do bobbin work and turn off all the thread cutters so that nothing will accidentally activate and try to cut some of these heavy threads. All right, so those are some of the really important things that we always need to remember with bobbin work. And the other thing, I think maybe that was it. I think I covered most of what I wanted to talk to you about in this introductory video. So gather your threads, get some fabric prepared, and start stitching out some samples. I'm going to talk to you next about the project itself and some of the ways that I came up with this ideas of what to do with some bobbin work to actually make something that you can keep as a record that you might want to keep somewhere in your house as a decorative stitching project. So okay, I think that's about it for now. Thank you for watching the video, and the next time I come back I'm going to actually do a couple of videos where I'm working with stuff on the computer, because I'm going to be combining for my project, I'm going to be doing some decorative stitching in bobbin work, and I'm going to be doing some machine embroidery bobbin work on our project. And anyway, that project isn't completed yet, so I can't yet show it to you, but the next couple of videos are going to be talking about machine embroidery, some stuff with some software, and what you're going to be looking for if you're going to do bobbin work on the sewing machine, as well as on the embroidery side. So anyway, that's about it for now. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you all soon. Bye for now.